the Good Jobs Debate. We have the pleasure of being joined by a panel of some of Canada's top economists. They will offer their own perspectives on the challenges facing Canada's job market. How bad is it out there? Why aren't there enough good jobs? And most importantly, what can we do about it? So to set the stage for our debate, let me introduce our moderator. Trish Hennessy is the founding director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Ontario office. She also founded and directed the CCPA's national project examining income inequality in Canada, which began in 2006. Her monthly Hennessy's Index takes a snapshot of key economic and social issues and breaks them down by the numbers. Trish is a former newspaper journalist and a renowned communicator. Please join me in welcoming Trish Hennessy.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here. The old Maple Leaf Center, isn't this cool? Talk about good jobs. This is a weekend of a power play. We're going to talk about how it is that we can make sure that the future of Canada is paved with good jobs so that future generations can live the good life, which is ultimately the Canadian promise. Now, I work for a think tank. We deal with economists. We deal with numbers. I'm going to give you just a couple of numbers. 112,000. That's the number of jobs that Canada's private sector lost in the month of August alone. 66%. That's the participation rate in the labour market in Canada in the month of August, and that's the lowest that it's been in the last 13 years. Now, I'm not just plugging my Hennessy's Index, which is available at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives table at the back of the room. There's our communications director, Jennifer Story. We've got a number of these hard copies to take away. Thought I'd give a shameless promotion there. But it's not just about the Hennessy's Index that focuses on good jobs this month. We are really talking about what's going on in Canada's labour market and what can we do to fix things. And so we thought, you know, it's Friday night in the big smoke. Let's get some of Canada's brightest economic and financial thinkers and ask them what they think. So let me introduce them. Let's start with Jim Stanford, shall we? Yeah. Unifor economist. Jim is the volunteer advisory board chair for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Ontario office, which is located on this campus just a few blocks away. Jim was instrumental in helping us found that office, which is just barely 2 years old. You've read Jim's columns in the Globe and Mail. You've seen him on the CBC's National The Bottom Line panel. And if you haven't read one of his many books, but if you haven't read Economics for Everyone, looking for a good primer introduction into economic issues, it's a must read. I highly recommend it. So, Jim, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Next, let me introduce to you my excellent colleague, CCPA Ontario's economist, Kaylie Tiessen. Kaylie is just celebrating her first year with the CCPA. We're so happy to have her. And just in her first year alone, she's been establishing herself as a leading voice in Ontario when it comes to income inequality, poverty reduction, and jobs analysis. You can read her blogs on behindthenumbers.ca, which is the CCPA blog site. So welcome, Kaylie.
Thank you.
Okay, next, please welcome Todd Hirsch. Todd Hirsch is considered by Alberta Venture as one of the 50 most influential Albertans. So welcome this guy to the stage. He is ATB financial chief economist. He writes for the Globe and Mail as well. He writes books. His latest book is The Boiling Frog Dilemma, How to Stop Canada's Economic Decline. So another must read, and welcome, Todd. And last but not least, please welcome to the stage Preet Banerjee. Now, Preet is a personal finance expert. He actually is the host of the Million Dollar Neighborhood, which is on Oprah Winfrey Network. So Oprah gives him the thumbs up. Preet also writes for the Globe and Mail, and you see him monthly on the CBC's Bottom Line panel along with Jim Stanford, and together they make just a powerful duo on that show. Welcome, Preet. Okay, so now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty about, we're going to lay down what's going on in Canada's labor market right now. And let's just start with the basic. Let's set a baseline. What constitutes a good job in Canada? And are we losing those kind of good jobs, or are there more to come? So I'm going to ask this of everyone. Jim, maybe you want to get us started?
Well, Trish, I'm sorry. There's just, before I answer that question, there's just one thing I've got to do. Sorry. Excuse me. I've got to do this. That'll be even bigger than Ellen's selfie at the Oscars. Because there's less money in this room than there is at the Oscars, but a lot more passion, I would say. So there we go. I was just dying to do that. Well, what is a good job anyway? I mean, we could talk about the sort of quantitative or empirical indicators, about the pay of the job, the security, the tenure of the job, and the benefits, whether you're actually getting a pension or not. I actually think in a way there's something even deeper than that. I would say a good job is a job where they treat you as a human being rather than just a productive input, That's the sort of the human side to it. And that does mean making a decent wage, because you have to support yourself and you have to support your family and allow yourself to come back to work healthy and motivated and support your kids and so on. It requires security, it requires a pension, but it also requires other things, maybe some of the intangibles like respect, dignity, or even fulfilling work, not just to give people a chance to show some creativity and fulfillment at work. So that's how I would define a good job.
That's a good starting point. Kaylie.
He totally stole all of my lines, guys. All of them.
Go take a selfie. That'll be...
I actually would say that decent pay is right there at the top, and it's something that we really need to talk about, especially when we're seeing this polarization in our labor market, and a lot of young people don't have access to a decent paying job, one where we can move out of our parents' basement, which I am now able to do because my job is permanent. Woo! But also we really need to see stability. I would like to have benefits, whether that means extended health benefits or even just paid sick days. Paid sick days, I think, are something that's really important. I love it when the people who are working at restaurants or other places, or even my colleagues, when they're not coughing on me. I think that's a really good thing. And finally, I think meaningful work is very important, whether that means making sure that we're respected in our office place or in our workplace, or working at something that we're really passionate about. All of those things make a meaningful job, and that's really important as well.
And sorry about coughing on you like that, Kaylie. Todd.
Well, first of all, let me say how thrilled I am to be here, and thank you to Unifor and to Jim for inviting me out. It's always a real pleasure to be out in Toronto. The question about good jobs I've been thinking a lot about ever since Jim invited me to be at this summit. And it made me think about the difference between a job and a career. And it's maybe a little bit glib to say a good job is something that should fuel your passions. I think a good career is something that should fuel your passions. But every one of us, and including me in various iterations in my early career, we've had jobs. And I'm not going to lie and say every job I had fueled my passion. But I think a good job and a good career is something where, aside from the pay, obviously those things are really important, but something that provides an opportunity for continuous learning. I've got to be learning something new all the time. The very first job I had was in the mid to late 80s, I guess, in Alberta, when the economy was not good there at all. And I was what I called is the Slurpee King of South Edmonton. I worked at 7-Eleven. And I'm not going to lie and say that job fueled my passion, but I learned a lot in that job. And I think from that, I was able to take what I learned about how to work with people, how to work in situations, and then move that into other jobs and finally careers. So I would say, aside from good pay and good benefits, something where you always have the opportunity to learn something new.
Sounds good. Preet.
Well, yeah, it's a great answer. First, I do want to take the opportunity to say that when they introduced the panelists and leading economic minds, you should have said leading economic minds and me, because I'm not an economist. I actually trained as a neuroscientist, and then I tried my hand at racing cars for a living. And then I ended up in personal finance. So I can tell you about changing careers. And
on the fast track.
Yeah, that's right. I'm on track for about 20 career changes by the time I retire. So I'm still trying to figure out what a good job is. But when I ask people around me what they look for in a job, obviously pay is up there. We've hit most of the main points. And I think people want room for improvement, right? They always want to grow, not only, family-wise in terms of the work-life balance, but also when they're working, they want to see that they're progressing towards something that fuels them, that motivates them. They want stability in their industry and careers. And I think we're seeing that a lot of people have you don't see the 25 and 50-year gold watch awards anymore, right? That's sort of a foreign concept now for people entering the workforce. But they do want some kind of stability in what they choose to do as their career overall.
Stability, that's a good point too. Okay, so that's the baseline. These are the ingredients for a good job. It's what we all seek. It's what we all aspire toward. Are we on a decline? Are we losing the ability to promise these good jobs, especially to future generations?
My research has actually focused pretty extensively on that, and we're seeing that a lot of things that Jerry mentioned already this morning, a lot of those good jobs are disappearing. A quick growth in temporary work over permanent work all the way back to the turn of the century. Same thing for part-time work over full-time work. We can look at this polarization in incomes where we have fewer jobs in the middle, a couple more good jobs at the top, and a heck of a lot more jobs in the bottom where people are actually making less than $30,000 a year when they're working full-time. That also plays out in the data about the minimum wage. When we look at in Ontario, the number of people earning the minimum wage has actually gone from about 4% to 9% since 2003. So there is, these jobs are disappearing, and it's something that we really need to think about.
Now, they're disappearing. Is it because sort of a recessionary, sort of long hangover, a cyclical problem, or is it structural?
It's definitely long-term. I originally, when I started looking at the data, I thought I would find that it was a cyclical issue, and it's not. It's the transition or the seismic shift started happening all the way back in the year 2000 or even before.
Right, and especially in Ontario.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely in Ontario. That's where most of my research focuses. That's where, this number from the minimum wage and other things have come. We also see that a lot of people who are working part-time would rather be working full-time. In Ontario, that number spiked. For prime-aged workers, 45% of prime-aged workers who are working part-time would rather be working full-time. So that's a huge indicator that we have a tiny problem in our labor market.
Tiny, yeah.
Todd, let's take this to Alberta. I mean, Alberta is kind of considered lotus land when it comes to, booming economy, good jobs. But can everybody access good jobs in Alberta?
Well, everyone can access a job in Alberta if they're willing to work and if they're willing to take something that maybe is not their ideal. But I would not say everyone can access a good job. A lot of the things that you mentioned are real in Alberta too, even though they're employed. They might be underemployed. They might be employed in a situation where they're not really engaged in what they're doing. I think a lot of the question comes down to, are we talking about, do good jobs exist anymore? I think we're in the transitional period in Ontario, in Alberta, across the country, in fact, where we haven't quite caught up yet in our mentality around what it is to work and where the new economy is going. Our traditional education systems and the way most of us were raised, even the millennials, the idea of training for a job or education is, sort of like the seal who can balance a ball on its nose. What the new economy is going to need is a seal who can pass it between his tail and his nose and do all kinds of other things. In other words, it has to be much more adaptable than simply training people to do one thing.
Right. So this is shifting, and more is required or demanded of workers in the future. What's driving this shift? Is it just the knowledge economy means you have to be bigger and better than ever?
Is that to me or?
Todd, as a follow-up, and then Jim?
Not bigger and better than ever, but more flexible than ever. And that's what I give advice to. I used to teach actually at the University of Calgary, and I loved the interaction with students. Had a lot of students who would come to me and ask, what can I do with my degree in economics? Because they were all looking for, a job as an economist. And I said, well, you're probably not going to get a job as an economist, but if you're willing to look at all of the broader things that actually your mind is trained to think about, look for all sorts of different opportunities and be flexible in that. You might have to take a job that you don't think is maybe exactly what you were trained to do, but if you can use your skills, your analytic skills, learning how to learn is really what we hope we're doing in the post-secondary.
To adapt to a changing labor market.
And flexibility.
Right. Jim, what's driving this issue?
I think there is a structural component, as Kaylie was saying, but I also think there is an issue of a prolonged weakness in the demand for workers. So I don't know if you call that cyclical in the traditional sense of just a short-term boom and bust cycle, but for many years we have been away from a situation where workers were in hot demand relative to the number of workers who are available to do the work. So in that situation, employers are able to offer jobs with inferior terms, if you like, inferior terms and conditions. Instead of offering someone a permanent job, they aren't worried that that person's going to go down the street to someone else. So they can keep them hungry for hours, they can roll over their contract. If the demand side of the scenario was a bit stronger, workers would say, no thanks, I'm going to go down the street and get a permanent job because that's what I actually need. So the fact that our economy, for various reasons, obviously the global financial crisis, but also austerity policies in the public sector, the high dollar and what that's done to our manufacturing sector, for all of those reasons, the demand side of the equation is too weak, and that is allowing employers to rely more on precarious work and part-time work and contract work.
I do want to just interject that there is something structural going on. If you take a look at the fact that we're at record levels of profitability, record levels of cash on balance sheets, you'd expect that there would be a commensurate increase in the labor market, but that hasn't happened. So something is going on structurally.
Yes.
So let's break that down. What is going on structurally? Jim, you look a lot at what's going on in terms of the manufacturing sector. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, of course, we have lost something like 400,000 manufacturing jobs since the early 2000s, and that is clearly part of the good jobs crisis. It's not a perfect explanation of the good jobs crisis because, first of all, there can be good jobs in services sectors, even in private services, if the conditions are right. And secondly, not every manufacturing job is a good job, frankly. Even before the meltdown began, some manufacturing jobs, frankly, were, shitty. Basically, that's a technical term we use in economics.
I'm not familiar with that economic term.
Yeah, it means a job you can't support your family on and you have no security around. So I think the meltdown in manufacturing and the structural change towards resources, yes, but there are a lot of good jobs in the resources sector. More the shift into sort of non-tradable, small-scale domestic services that's been driven in part by the high dollar and the offsetting of the downturn in manufacturing. That, I think, is that structural change in the economy has certainly contributed to the problem. But I don't accept the idea that jobs and services can't be good. They can be good and they must be good because services jobs are going to make up the majority of our work for all of eternity going forward.
So they can be good, but are they enough to fuel a sturdy, stable middle class? Easy questions.
Yeah, well, thanks for the easy one. No, as it stands, I don't think so. And I think that's borne out by the numbers. You see an exacerbation of the divide in income and wealth over time. The sentiment is that that's not changing. The World Economic Forum releases a ranking of global competitiveness of countries around the world, and Canada's been slipping back on that ranking. And the reason cited was lagging innovation. All right, so Canada, if I may say, is the greatest country in the world to live in. And we have a great developed educational system, and that doesn't make sense. I think to maybe address some of the structural issues, we have to refocus and look at research and development and fostering an environment where that is more of a forefront burner issue because you can't outsource a job that no one else can do. And the reality is, in a global economy where borders are coming down, if it can be done somewhere else cheaper, it's going to be done somewhere else cheaper.
And you know, so if you're a young person and you're hearing that, that's really depressing.
Yeah.
In economic terms, shitty, I think, is what they would say.
There, you're getting good at technical terms, Trish. Good.
I catch on
I
fast.
could teach you a few more after as well. as could all the other Unifor members in the audience.
So, you know, there's this Ecos poll, and Ecos asked Canadians, do you think that the next generation, your kids and your grandkids, are going to do as well or better as this generation? And the majority of Canadians said, no, I don't think that promise is there for upcoming generations. And, you know, you hear about this changing global economy. Preet, let's start with you. What's your advice to young people here?
You know, my advice is the same no matter what is going on in the economy, and that is to focus on being the hardest worker in the room. I don't often quote Arnold Schwarzenegger, but he said something that really resonated with me one time, and he says, the only guarantee against failure is total commitment. But you know what, there's a lot of young Canadians who are totally committed, and it's tough for them to get ahead, because when you look at just the demographic trends of what's going on with debt-to-income ratios, house prices versus income growth and whatnot, the deck really is stacked against young Canadians. So what I would suggest to younger Canadians is don't do what I did, which was not take advantage of all the resources available. So for example, here at Ryerson University, there's tons of resources available, career counseling offices, mentorship programs, whatnot. I never took part of any of those things, and I completely regret it. I should have done that, and you have to take advantage of every possible resource to get ahead if you want to try and compete in this environment. It is tougher, that's the reality. You can only control what you can control.
Mm-hmm. Todd,
yep.
So what's your advice to young people? And you know, you hear a lot of advice centered around, well, look, if you're young, you should be ready to travel. Go to where the jobs are. Go west, young man. What's your advice on that front?
I love that piece of advice, and I speak a bit fraudulently because I have never yet had the opportunity to live abroad. But one of the best pieces of advice I think I could offer somebody who is maybe just coming out of their post-secondary is, you know, go live overseas for a year or two. See a different culture, or even within Canada, if it's not quite, you know, you're able to do it overseas. Canada offers so many different and varied, wonderful perspectives of the world. You will come home a richer person for it. You'll come home with different experiences, how to see the world through different lenses. It'll give you empathy. It'll give you creativity. The best way to become an innovative thinker is actually from the neuroscience is to shock your brain into seeing different patterns that you're not used to seeing. And traveling and living abroad, especially. Travel, I think everyone would agree, travel is a different experience than living abroad, you know. And if you have the chance to do it for 6 months to 2 years, please come home. You know, we want you to come back to Canada. That's the other thing, one of the chapters in the book that I wrote, The Boiling Frog Dilemma. I have parents that come up to me and say, oh, if you encourage them to go live abroad, they're never going to want to come home. To which I say, you know, Canada is not a country a lot of people are fleeing from. We might momentarily want to flee in January, but I think we will come home. And actually, the best case scenario, they'll come home with somebody, you know, because then we're enriched by the immigrant experience and by the experience of having a Canadian-born young person seeing the world through different eyes.
Trish, if I can jump in on this, anytime you're asked to give advice to someone on how to get ahead in a really tough environment, you always have to have a balance between what's the advice to them as an individual to increase their chances of success in a tough environment, and I think all of those points are valid. But then there's also the issue of the collective solution to step back from that and say, yeah, you know, people are going to do the best that they can as individuals, but we as a society have to organize our affairs in such a way that even someone who isn't the top candidate still has the opportunity to make a decent wage and have a secure job. So that balance between the individual and the collective approach, I think, is important.
That's a really great point, Jim. And there's a movement, Generation Squeeze. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with this. They put out a report and they looked at what the government spends in terms of benefits, incentives, tax credits, etc., on people who are 65 and older versus people who are 45 and younger. And it was $45,000 per person on average for someone who was over 65, and $12,000 for someone who was under 45. And what they're basically saying is, you know what, we're not saying equalize it, because that would wreak havoc. Every senior citizen would be chasing you down the street. Not very fast, but they'd be chasing you. But if you just, change that skew from, $12,000 per person to $13,000 per person, that creates over $22 billion a year with which you could address some of the problems, which could be providing, cheap daycare so people can actually have a dual income family and not be burdened by or have someone staying at home and what have you. So there's a lot of things that we can look at. But it's more than just saying, well, that's a great idea. You have to motivate people. You have to mobilize the troops, as it were. And so if you look at people who are over 65, they've got CARP, Canadian Association of Retired Persons. For people under 45, what do you have? Well, Generation Squeeze is trying to be that voice and saying, listen, let's get together and be a voice. And we know that the voter turnout for people who are older is higher than people who are younger. So politicians will start listening to you if your votes are actually going to make a change. Right? And so if you get together and say, this is what we want to do, and be a voice like CARP, then that's how we can start to change that conversation.
Democracy, baby. Democracy. Kaylie, you've looked at this. You've looked at the numbers in terms of youth unemployment, youth underemployment, and you've heard the advice, well, the categorization of the problem as it's just a skills gap. That young people just are missing a lot of the skills required. Is it a skills gap or is it something else?
I really don't think so. I think that what we have is a training gap or even an experience gap, if you will. And there's a lot of different dynamics happening here. So a couple of stats, I apologize, I speak in numbers a lot. The Canadian employers have actually reduced the amount of money they spend on the job training by more than 40% over the past 20 years. So that's 40% less that we have in gaining experience and learning how to work on the job. Also, the expectation, as you were kind of alluding to earlier, the expectations of a new hire have actually risen quite a bit. So now we're looking at making sure you have a degree. You might also want to go on to a college diploma afterwards as well to show that you have the knowledge and the ability to apply that knowledge. And then you have to have 2 to 5 years experience even just to get your foot in the door. So what's really happening here is business has gotten out of the business of training their workers, and everyone else is kind of just left floundering, trying to figure out how to get your foot in the door. So we do everything that we're told, us young folks do everything that we're told, and we take unpaid internships, and we move overseas. We teach English as a second language somewhere in the world so that we can pay off our student debt, and we come back, and it still takes us 5 or 6 years to find that full-time permanent position. So there's a lot more at play.
Yeah, training. It's training.
Yeah, training.
So how do we get employers to get back in the business of training? Anyone?
It's a tough nut to crack. Again, as I alluded to before, the idea of being with a company for 25 years, 50 years, and getting that golden watch, again, that's a foreign concept now. You see a lot of people changing careers, not often as me, but many times throughout their working life. And so if they're willing to move, and if the stats have shown that by someone who is in an industry that affords it, you can move from company to company to get a higher lifetime income, then how do you get an employer to say, well, it's worth investing in someone who is more likely now than ever to leave you as opposed to stay with you for the long term? So it is tough.
Is there a possibility, though, that one of the reasons people are leaving is because they're feeling like they're not being invested in? And so maybe if there was a more symbiotic relationship there, people would be more willing and want to stay because they would know that they have the possibility of an advancement and earning more money in the future. I think it's both ways.
Yeah.
And we can imagine policies that push employers, that compel employers basically to invest something in their workers as they go along. And there's models of that from around the world. You could look at the German apprentice system, which is incredibly successful. They've got 700 recognized trades, and the employers take on the trades. So you basically have a guaranteed job at the end of the line, and the employers help to pay for it. Or a training tax type of model where employers, if they aren't doing any on-the-job training, have to pay to community colleges and others to do it. What we can't allow is for employers to take the cheap route out, to not invest anything in their workforce, and then complain about a lack of skilled workers right and when they are looking for someone.
How about economic diversification? Todd, what role does that play in terms of adapting to a changing economic reality?
Yeah, economic diversity, that's one of those, especially out in Western Canada. I can speak a little bit more from my experience in Alberta. For Alberta, we are not very economically diversified, and at the moment, It seems to be this, I always call economic diversity, it's the holy grail of policy, for policymakers. We chase it and chase it and chase it, and it always just seems a little bit outside of our grasp. But I do think the issue of economic diversity is important, not just for resource-based Western Canada, but also manufacturing and service-based Central Canada. The more diversified we are, the better off, or the better our opportunities will be. I think this is where it's really important for Canadian companies and for Canadian workers to understand our global position here in Canada. And that takes a bit of a refocusing, because for so long we've thought of ourselves as a country that exports manufactured goods, exports barrels of oil, exports lumber. More and more we have to be thinking of ourselves as where do we fit into the global value-added chain. And that may or may not involve exporting a thing, but exporting an idea, or tying in with an idea with other countries. But that sort of, it's a major shift in thinking, I think, and that's required here in Canada. But that's what I think will bring the economic diversity that we're desperate for.
Preet, in a knowledge economy, innovation is king. Are we well positioned on that front, or is there more that we need to do?
I think we are well positioned, but we're not translating that into results. If you take, again, the last 20 years, you take a look at the average amount of skills that someone is graduating with, it's higher than it's ever been. And yet when you take a look at the percentage of jobs that are low skill, that hasn't changed, right? You expect that to go down and more skilled jobs to be available. I guess this is as good a time as any to talk about the Temporary Foreign Workers Program. That program, whatever the original intentions were, was just so falsely put into place or executed poorly that it basically disrupts the normal functioning of a labor market, which is when you can't find someone to fill a job, you don't find a way to get someone else from out of the country to do it cheaper. You raise the wage, right? So that program, if I may be so bold, should be completely scrapped, replaced with something that does the intentional, does something that does what was originally intended, and let the labor market function the way that it's supposed to work.
Okay, let me take you up further on this one, and maybe Jim, you want to answer this one. We know that that the labor market erects bigger barriers for some people. So if you come from a racialized background, if you're an indigenous person, if you're a new Canadian, if you're a woman, there are all kinds of barriers. And we're going to be spending the weekend talking about how to break down those barriers. What advice do you give the crowd today?
Well, you're absolutely right, Trish. The evidence is overwhelming. I think especially for workers from racialized communities, Indigenous workers, new Canadians, it's a wicked labor market out there, and for them it's twice as wicked because of the discrimination they face, the lack of access to the few good jobs that are being created. And then it becomes a bit of a self-perpetuating cycle, you know, especially as income is polarized and poverty becomes concentrated, then, you know, it's all the harder to get out of that and to get one of the few good jobs that are out there. And it's not just the problem that's racialized. I think the solution has to become racialized as well. And I learned something really interesting today at that research symposium that the Center for Labor Management Relations hosted here as the first event of the weekend. And that's the story of the successful fight to stop the outsourcing of 1,100 cleaners' jobs at the city of Toronto. And there was an incredible coalition that came together and completely changed how the issue was being framed, so that it was no longer an issue about just the city saving some money because you could get an outside contractor to hire people at the minimum wage. It was now framed as a matter of equity, fairness, addressing the polarization and the poverty of Toronto, of certain neighborhoods in Toronto. And in Toronto, of course, that's all about racialized communities. And because they framed it as an issue of equity and inclusion and said this is not something that the city itself can contribute to, things are bad enough, the city can't be doing it, and they organized in racialized communities, and they got community leaders, even religious leaders, to speak out against the outsourcing of the jobs, and lo and behold, they won. And that, believe it or not, was saving 1,100 jobs and keeping them good jobs in a public sector operation rather than turning them into shitty jobs in outsourced minimum wage contractors was the first major defeat of the Ford administration here, and it was a victory for all of us, which shows me when workers of color win, we all win, and we have to make that a motto for our organizing going forward.
And Jim, what's the role of unions in all of this in the future? I mean, we know from research that unions have been a great equalizer in society by giving democratic voice to workers. What's the future for unions in terms of ensuring good jobs and giving voice to all workers?
Well, the future responsibility is certainly there on unions. I don't think there's ever actually been a society on earth that has achieved what we would call inclusive prosperity without widespread unionization or collective bargaining of some kind. You need to have the institutional power to allow average working people to get a share of the wealth that they produce. Martin Luther King once said, "The best anti-poverty program is a union," and that's a good motto. So the challenge is can unions do it? The environment is very, very hostile to unionization and collective bargaining now for many, many reasons. The attitudes of employers, the flexibility that employers have thanks to globalization. The attitudes of government have changed. I mean, in the early post-war decades, government thought collective bargaining was a good thing precisely because it helped to share the pie better and helped to support the emergence of a middle class, which until then didn't really exist. So that's all changed, and in the face of that, unions have to step up their game, for sure. We have to get better and more creative at organizing and communicating and finding ways to make a difference. And we also have to fight for a fair context, for labor laws and other structures that allow unions to do it. Without a strong role for unions, I don't think we will solve the problem of good jobs. I really don't.
Kaylie. Actually, I'm going to ask this of all of you, but I'll start with Kaylie. What's the role in government in all of this?
Wow, that's a huge question.
Big one.
And the role of government is multifaceted. So I would say two of the most important things are government can raise the bar, and government can also be an excellent role model to other employers in our economy in Canada. So raising the bar, what does that mean? Well, we could look at a higher minimum wage, for one thing. In Ontario, we have this great campaign looking at making the minimum wage $14 an hour. $14 an hour, and that would make a huge difference in people's lives.
And you're just getting started, aren't you?
Pardon?
You're just getting started.
I've got my counting fingers out here. So 1, minimum wage. 2, let's talk about a living wage and what living wage policies could look like for governments across the country. We could, just like looking at the, what you were just talking about with all the cleaners in Toronto, we could make sure that government is paying every employee a living wage so that people can actually afford to live a decent life in whatever city they're living in. So that's another important point. And we could also look at employment standards and all of the different employment standards that government has put in place, but also enforcing those employment standards. You saw in maybe, I think it was in the Toronto Star yesterday, the government went ahead, the Ontario government went ahead and looked at all of the different companies that have interns across the province. And I think, what did they find? 45% were not actually following the Employment Standards Act. So that's something that we need to really, really look at, make sure that we have standards and that they're also being followed and adhered to. So that's raising the bar. We also need to make sure that government is a good role model. So there we could look at, stopping the freeze on public sector wages. Because if we're not raising the wages of the workers in government, then who's out there saying that everyone else can also afford it? It's very, very important. You know what? I think I'm going to stop there for now, but the list could go on and on.
I have a question, if I may.
Okay.
And don't shoot me, but I want to ask this, and maybe you can enlighten me and maybe some other people. If you increase the minimum wage, studies have shown that translates into lost jobs.
Some studies have shown that.
Okay, so maybe you can back up the claim that, just an increase, not that I'm saying, listen, I want people to be better off, I just want to make sure that we go about it the right way. So let's talk about that, because again, if I talk to small business employers and they say, all right, wages are going to go up for minimum by 40%, they're going to say, well, I can't hire that many people, so I'm going to have less people working for me. So some people are going to be better off and some people are going to lose jobs. So what's your response to that?
I think that one of the things that we need to do is look at making sure that the workers we do have in the country actually have enough money to live and to put back into the economy. And when that happens, then there's more money floating around to hire more people. That has been one of the findings. We've also found that there is sort of a positive employment effect when the minimum wage is raised, and it means that employers are actually investing in training for their employees. There's less turnover, and so that ends up being a cost reduction for employers as well. We just haven't been very good at getting that message out. We need to start talking about that side of the equation too.
Yeah, I guess at some point you have to start asking how much is public policy driving employers' expectation and lowering expectations there, and I guess that speaks to how government sets the tone. Jim, what about that argument that minimum wage can actually have a bad effect on jobs?
Well, I think in a way you need to be doing a two-pronged approach, actually. I think you do need to lift the bar in terms of the quality of work, as Kaylie was just indicating. But at exactly the same time, you do have to be pushing purchasing power into the overall economy so that the demand for labor will increase enough to make sure people are still employed. And I think you do need to do the both at once. The studies on the minimum wage, some of them do find the evidence that Preet was indicating in certain areas. Some of them find that the employment effects are very negligible. In fact, CCP Ontario will be having a study coming out shortly, co-written by me, that compiles some of that evidence. But I don't deny Preet's point that there is evidence if you're not doing anything to increase the spending power in the economy, then just lifting the minimum wage on its own isn't going to solve the problem. So that's where we need to be imagining how do we get more purchasing power from consumers so they can patronize those small businesses? How do we get more purchasing power going from businesses so that they start spending the money rather than sitting on it? From governments, so they're investing in public services instead of cutting back, and from the rest of the world in the form of their demand for our exports of goods and services. If we get the quality and the quantity going at the same time, that's when we'll solve the problem, I believe.
Okay, I'm going to let Todd and Preet just sort of give their final on the role of government. Like, just say you're the Minister of Good Jobs for a day. What's your priority?
Well, my priority would be, I think the very best investment government can make at all is in education, in K-12 and post-secondary. And especially when we see a lot of students across the country, access to some of those post-secondary programs, be it because of tuitions or be it because of just spaces available, when that access is not afforded to them, they are at risk of sort of falling through those cracks. Now, education alone, having a degree, is not going to guarantee a job, but it is a strong correlation with successful moving into the workforce successfully. So I would say more investment. If you're going to invest in anything, invest in education.
Whoa. Todd just cornered the student audience with that one.
Whoa. Well, allow me to dovetail onto that by saying that if you have a more skilled workforce with lots of investment in there, you need to have jobs for them to take here in Canada. And so to that end, what government, I think, should consider is, again, taking a look at how they foster an environment where businesses flock to come here so that there are more jobs available for the people who are highly trained and highly skilled to take them. So by fostering research, development, innovation, and again, if you have jobs that can't be outsourced anywhere else because no one else can do it, then I think that maximizes the potential that we have as Canadians. Okay.
All right. We want to hear from you now. So if you'd like to ask a question from our esteemed panel or make a comment, you just line up at one of the two mics, and we're going to go. We'll let a few questions go at a time, and then we'll bring it back to the panel. So please line up.
Trish, just while people are coming, you did such a good job tonight. I hope Peter Mansbridge wasn't watching. He'll be worried for his job on the bottom line panel if he saw that.
Thank you, Peter. I hope you didn't hear that. Question over here.
Hi, thank you very much for all the insights and for sharing all the numbers. Thank you, Kaylie. I have a number for you. In Ontario, the 15% of the population are self-identified as persons with disabilities. And the terrible, terrible percentage of unemployment for students, which is extremely high, does not compare with the unemployment rate of persons with disability who are qualified, who now have better access to universities, like they have ramps, they have assistants in the classroom, and they have not only one degree, they have masters, but because the disability is the first thing they see, and all the myths are out that they're going to be missing jobs and it's not going to be good, there's a continuous denial and barriers for persons with disabilities. And if I were to put this into perspective, if we don't include this in the conversation, it's like in the 50s, any conversation about employment that did not include women or persons of colors would now be seen as terribly discriminatory. Well, this is what is happening right now with persons with disabilities who are ready, able, and capable to work.
Excellent point. Thank you. Okay, do we have people lined up at this mic? Next to you.
Stephen Seaborn, the Ontario Federation of Labour and other places. I was just wondering if the panel could comment on the question of the siphoning off of corporate taxes and how that impacts jobs. Because if we're looking at solutions, it would seem to me, I'd like to hear from the panel, what is the solution in terms of our taxation base that has been pretty much undermined? Okay. And how, what steps would we take? I'd like to hear from the panel. That'd be great.
You bet. Okay, next question.
Yes, I'm Michael Rosenberg. The issue of innovation or research, rather than thinking that would create anything or create wealth or jobs, those kinds of changes in the economy are actually reducing productivity. It means that more and more resources are being used in innovative ways that are actually not really producing very much. And the greater complexity, the greater technology in the economy, the continuous change is actually harming the ability to have a productive economy. So, yeah, I mean, for a long period of time, that was thought to be something that would improve the economy. And in the last 30 years or so, we found out that actually innovation reduces productivity. It harms the economy. And really, that's the reason wages keep going down. And if we really want minimum wage to keep going up, we can't have an economy that keeps going down. Eventually, they will cross and it will be impossible. So let's see that innovation is seen as the harmful thing that reduces productivity.
Okay. All right. Final question over here.
Good evening. My name is Sonny Young. I'm a candidate for TSB Ward 17, Don Valley East. My question is for Preet Banerjee. Under the Harris government and Eves, for 9 years, minimum wage stayed at $6.85, and then under McGuinty, in 2004, it went up incrementally each year up until 2010, and that didn't kill jobs. So I'm wondering what theory you have that raising minimum wage would kill jobs when the reality is we have an aging population and there aren't enough qualified people to work, unless if you want to bring in more temporary foreign workers to do the crap jobs that Canadians don't want to do.
Okay, all right, thanks very much. Now, before we go to the panel, we just want to take a little bit of break. I have a cryptic note here, so I'm going to hand this over to Patty on the floor.
And I was just going to turn it over to Justin Trudeau to say a few words.
Oh, well.
Sure. Thank you. First of all, I just want to congratulate Unifor and all the partners for putting together just an amazing good job summit here. Really interested in the panel discussion because a lot of the things that I've been struggling with, that we've been struggling with, it's great to see Libby Davies here, the NDP, and Liberal parties here as well, because we really, really hope that there's going to be a change of government next year, both of us in our ways. I think everyone can applaud that. But the challenge that we're facing when you ask Trish what government can actually do is something we actually have to really struggle with, because there has been over the past 30 years stalling, a stagnation of There we go. A stagnation of incomes for the middle class. Even though our economy has more than doubled in size, the median family income has increased by only 15%. So most Canadians haven't had a real raise in about 30 years. And there are people who say that Canada is on the receiving end of global forces beyond our control. But the fact is that if we can't solve this here in Canada, I don't know where in the world they're going to be able to solve this problem, which is a very, very real one, of how we can create success that comes from the middle out. And a couple of things that were brought forward that I really think are going to be absolutely essential. And the first one, of course, is education. Making sure that even though Canada's pretty close to leading the world at a little over 50% post-secondary education attainment rate, we know that 7 out of 10 future jobs are going to require post-secondary education of some sort, whether it's university or college or skills training or diplomas. We need to make sure that we're hitting 70% post-secondary education, and that's going to mean government leadership from the federal government that works with provincial governments who are delivering it, that works with institutions, that works with the corporate sector to make sure that there are training investments, that there is what's being done to prepare our young people for the knowledge economy. We're also going to have to make sure that we are... Just a second. I will get to my question. People are impatient for all the answers. Trust me, I get that from the press gallery in Ottawa. The fact of the matter is, we also need to make sure we're stepping up in investing in infrastructure. And that's something that I haven't heard enough about, and I'd like to hear you guys on where you think the benefits of infrastructure jobs are coming. Because we know that in order for Canada to do well, for the middle class to do well, we have to be investing in infrastructure to create good jobs now, but also to create the growth for the economy that's going to bring the prosperity we need for wide swaths of people. So I'd really like to hear all of you on infrastructure spending and how the government needs to step up more. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this Good Jobs Summit. Thank you, Jerry, for including me. Thank you, Libby, for always being here.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, question from Libby. It's a hockey rink. I guess there are hecklers here.
Okay, Libby Davies, Member of Parliament for Vancouver East. I don't think it was entirely... I don't think it was entirely planned that the politicians would stand up in a row, but here we are. First of all, thank you so much for a very stimulating and refreshing discussion. I think it's a great way to start this weekend, and what a great initiative this is, the Good Jobs Summit. You mentioned the minimum wage, and I'm very proud that the federal New Democrats have made a commitment to increase the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. That's a very important foundation. But I do think it speaks to a larger issue that was touched upon, but maybe we could go into it some more, and that's this huge issue of income inequality in this country. We're an incredibly wealthy country, and yet more and more people are being left behind in low-wage, precarious work, or no work at all, or on welfare, or struggling without housing or childcare and all of these things. So I hope the panel might be able to also touch on some of the concrete things that we need to do to address income inequality in Canada. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's take this back to the panel and then see what extra time we have. I see people are still lined up. All right, who wants to tackle which one? Income inequality, pushback on minimum wage,
sure, yeah.
Getting people with disability into the workforce, infrastructure and corporate taxes, a wealth of issues. Pick and choose. Preet.
I guess I'll start with a quick answer to the question about innovation and how it hasn't worked. Would you rather have someone else doing it? I don't know if that's the right path to go down. With respect to the question about minimum wage from, I think it was this gentleman over here, my position is I don't know, which is why I was throwing it back to the economists. The studies that I have seen have shown some pretty clear supporting evidence to show that it hasn't, but you cited some research that hasn't. So I think it's one of those things where we need to definitively know what the effects are before we can say, well, this is what the policy should be.
Okay, Todd.
I'll maybe tackle the question on infrastructure. I think this is another very pressing issue. And again, speaking with my better understanding of what's happening in Alberta, we are strained in Alberta with insufficient schools, with insufficient hospitals and university space and roads, and just about anything infrastructure-based we are lacking. We are probably 10 years behind. And my understanding of the rest of the country is it is just as strained. As I travel around other places in the country, I do see crumbling bridges and all of these things. For some reason, 50 years ago, collectively, as a country, we felt very important that we invest in these things. And now there seems to be a real hesitancy. I don't know if it's just because of strained government finances, or I'm not sure where the hesitancy comes, why it's so difficult for governments to really invest heavily in infrastructure. But from a business perspective, I mean, this is about the best. If education is the best investment we can make long-term in our people, infrastructure is the best investment we're going to be able to make long-term in our business community, just transporting goods and services and ourselves around. So infrastructure, very important.
Yeah, also with aging infrastructure, I mean, we're still living off of the infrastructure that our parents and grandparents built for us. And the advent of extreme weather, it's just becoming a non-negotiable. Kaylie.
I think I'm going to tackle the question about discrimination for people with disabilities. I had the opportunity to live for 3 years in Southeast Asia, and I worked at a vocational training center started by women with disabilities for women with disabilities. It was the best experience and hardest experience of my life, and I learned that change has to come from the community. So it means standing up and asking the tough questions in rooms like this to remind all of us that inclusion means including everyone. And it also means that, I guess one thing that I learned is my boss is a woman who had suffered from polio and had an atrophied leg. And I think she worked like 28 or 29 hours a day trying to make sure that every woman that came through the center had the confidence, the skills, and the ability to go back to their hometown and start a business, do something different and something that their community needed. And so I don't have the answer, but I would say that it has to come from the community, and it's a tough slog. And I will commit to raising that issue more often in my own work.
Well played.
Jim.
Well, I earlier was speaking about the need to have a two-pronged approach, the quality of jobs, but the quantity of spending power in the economy to support job creation. And there was 2 points in the discussion that I think fit very nicely into the spending power end of it. One is the issue about income inequality. I mean, quite in addition to the moral concerns that we have about it and the health effects and the damage to our community, the growing polarization of income at the top is also very bad for the economy. The reality is, if you've got a lot of money, then you tend to sock away a lot of any extra money that you get, and that becomes an ongoing drain on purchasing power. That is, the high savings ratios of high-income households. And even international groups like the OECD have recognized that the polarization of income is a factor that's undermining spending power and slowing down the recovery from the global crisis. So good economic reasons as well as moral reasons to tackle income inequality. The other one is on infrastructure. There are huge needs for infrastructure. We've already noticed that. And there's room to spend literally hundreds of billions of dollars in Canada to create projects that we need and facilities that we need. And that has two benefits. It has an immediate benefit of putting people to work building those things, and then a secondary benefit of enhancing our quality of life and our efficiency once they're built. And it is this fetish that we've had, that we've been allowed to sort of ram down our throats, that the top economic priority is balancing the budget at all costs, that's holding back government from doing this. And I watched I didn't know whether to laugh or cry yesterday when I saw the Prime Minister say, "Hooray, we outperformed our budget target by $10 billion. The budget deficit was supposed to be $16 billion and it came in at $6 billion. Aren't we good managers?" Well, the reality is, if you miss your target by $10 billion in any direction, you are not a good manager, first of all. But secondly, The wasted opportunity of taking that money and investing it. The government can borrow money at 2% interest, and that's nominal interest. That's barely 0% real interest after adjusting for inflation. The benefits of those investments would be enormous. If only we could get out of that sort of blinkered view that the only thing that matters is balancing the budget. They're balancing the budget but driving the economy into the ground, and that's the wrong way to go.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. So I think we've got room for 2 more questions. Before we do that, I just want to acknowledge and thank Justin Trudeau and Libby Davies. You know, we live in a time when we ask our politicians to come and listen to us about this and take action on income inequality and jobs, and it's great to see them both here listening to that and asking questions themselves of the group. So thank you for that. All right, 1 question over here and 1 question over here, and then we're going to wrap up.
Hi, so every university in Canada now has some kind of small business incubator, and Ryerson is the biggest one in Canada. So my question is, how much is entrepreneurship a part of the solution, and how do we make sure that the funding and training in those programs are not going to those who are already privileged?
Entrepreneurship, and then 1 last question over here.
Yeah, Frank Polia from Thunder Bay. I'm the co-chair of the Workforce Planning Board. And in Northern Ontario and Northwestern Ontario, the mining sector is growing and they need skilled trades. Can you discuss the opportunity in the skilled trades that are occurring? We are living evidence that there is a tremendous need, and the mining sector will bring them from anywhere in the world, being a very mobile workforce, unless we have them here in Canada, in Ontario.
Skilled trades. Okay, all right. Entrepreneurialism, skilled trade, and 1 more. I don't have my glasses on. Is that Alistair? Yeah, Alistair would go for it.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. My name is Alistair Woods. I'm the chairperson of the Canadian Federation of Students Ontario. We represent 350,000 college and university students. So first of all, thank you to the panelists. It was a really great discussion. I know Kaylie and Jim, and Jim always connects very well with young people with his selfies and the Twitter. He knows how us millennials work. My question, though, very briefly, is about the issue of unpaid internships. Jeremy brought up in his opening remarks that there are over 300,000 young people working for free. And in my job, I have the privilege of traveling this province and talking to young people. And I've met people who work 40 hours a week for free. And they won't report it to the authorities because they're terrified that if they do, they'll never get a job in that sector, whatever that sector is, ever again. And I guess my question is, what do you propose as a solution to the issue of unpaid internships? I know what I would do, which is that they should all be paid, period. All work deserves payment. But I would like to hear from our panelists. What are your thoughts and what are your opinions on the role of internships and payment of internships? Thanks.
Good question. Thanks. Okay, Preet, and then we'll just go down the line, and Jim, you can take us home.
Okay, so I'll start with entrepreneurship. I think entrepreneurship needs to be fostered. It speaks to innovation, which I've clearly been on record now saying is that we need more innovation. What I'm worried about is that when you have entrepreneurs in Canada strike it big, it's very alluring for people to want to then go down to the States, because it's very alluring for them to then grow an idea that was successful here and then mature it down there. So I'd like to see more support, even more support for entrepreneurs, so they stay up here, so we have a true Silicon Valley North. With respect to unpaid internships, I agree. I think that work needs to be rewarded, and I think given how tough things are for young Canadians, it kind of says something that if you force unpaid internships to be illegal and a company can't afford to pay people, that's probably a really good indicator that that's not an industry that has bright prospects. So, I mean, it's kind of like self-selection there, but absolutely people need to be paid for the work that they do. Otherwise, the alternative, they go back to school and incur more student debt trying to be competitive. So it's a snafu for young Canadians, and we have to do something about that.
Absolutely. Okay, now I see the clock is winding down, so in a minute or less.
I'll be really brief on entrepreneurialism. I think it's one of the most important issues that Canadians have to grapple with, but I don't think it's something that governments are particularly well equipped to manage it. Yeah, incubators are helpful, but if we want to be a creative, innovative, entrepreneurial group of people, that's the heavy lifting that Canadians have to decide as a people. Are we going to be entrepreneurial or not? And on the unpaid internship, it's really startling to me that this happens. My question is, why would we keep doing this? Not the employers. Why would we keep volunteering? I could see maybe I will come and work for free for you for 2 weeks or maybe a month. But I think, you know, the onus is also on the students to say there's limits to how much I'm going to do this.
They're too afraid to speak up.
Well, yeah, I know.
And I don't blame them.
Well, I'm not saying speak up. I'm just saying do it at all. You know, and I would agree with you. This is not an industry that you really probably don't want to. Do you want to be part of this industry if they don't really have the ethics to pay you?
All right. I was thinking a lot about self-employment and entrepreneurship today, and I looked up some numbers. So over the past year, so August 2013 to August 2014, the number of people who are self-employed in Canada grew by 75,000. So people are trying to be entrepreneurial. Why? Because there aren't other opportunities for good jobs in our country. But we also know that those jobs often pay a lot less, and they're very precarious. So we have this idea that we want to foster entrepreneurship. We want people to be doing everything they can, but it's also it's really scary, and it's really difficult to start your own business and get things going.
There's only so much you can do on your own.
That's right.
Okay, Jim, final word to you.
Well, let me jump in on the skilled trades point. We agree, skilled trades are incredibly important and they're necessary, and we're going to face a huge demographic transition in the existing skilled trades workforce over the next decade or 15 years. The problem is it's like pulling teeth to try and get employers to invest in apprentices because you've got to spend the years on the apprenticeship before you get your ticket. So we need to be finding ways with a mixture of public funding and compulsion on industry to do its share of the apprenticeship training. And if you put those together with the guarantee of a job at the end, like the German system has, you'll have people lining up around the block to go. I don't buy the argument that there's a cultural bias against manual labor or blue-collar trades. I don't buy that for a minute. The salary those skilled trades guys make will overcome any cultural bias pretty darn quick.
Okay, thank you. On time as well. Can you think of another group of people who could cover such a wide range of topics about the labor market, structural, the systemic, individual, ethical, bringing up all of these excellent points? Let's give a round of applause to this excellent panel. Thank you for your time, your wisdom, your expertise. Thank you.